Imagine you are the ruler of a new dynasty, one that has risen to power on the smoldering ruins of the old world. In your hands rests the army, the church, and the absolute right to decide what is considered truth and what is condemned as heresy. Chronicles are already being rewritten in your name. Unwanted documents are curling into ash inside monastery furnaces. Priests speak your genealogy from the pulpit as though it were scripture. The peasants kneel. The boyars bow. And the map of the empire stretches wider with each passing year. But then, disturbing reports begin arriving from the northern borders. Scouts and soldiers returning from beyond the Arctic frontier describe something that should not exist. Amidst the ice and permafrost, they are finding not a barren wasteland, but traces of enormous stone cities, complex irrigation channels carved into frozen earth, and ports with harbors large enough to receive ocean-going vessels. This is infrastructure that was clearly built over centuries, refined by generations of skilled hands. And it does not belong to you. It has never belonged to you. Now consider the political nightmare unfolding before you. If the people learn that a great civilization once flourished in the north while your ancestors were still huddled in earth shelters, your entire myth of enlightening the savages will crumble to dust. The legitimacy of the throne itself will come into question. So what do? With one decree, these lands are declared non-historical. The climate is pronounced to have always been harsh and uninhabitable. The ruins are dismissed as whimsical formations of nature, curiosities of geology rather than evidence of grandeur. The question that should haunt every honest mind is brutally simple. Would you choose to acknowledge that you came to something already built, that you merely seized someone else's heritage? Or would you erase the memory of your predecessors so thoroughly that even their cities vanish from the maps, leaving you as the sole bearer of civilization? Now let us see how this looked in real history. Open any climate map of Russia. Find the city of Pustozersk in the far north. Now look at the numbers and let them sink in. The average annual air temperature is -1 degree Celsius. Winter lasts 10 months out of 12. The remaining 2 months cannot honestly be called summer. They are a miserable stretch of swamps, clouds of mosquitoes so thick they darken the air, and cold rains that never seem to end. The polar night swallows almost half the year without interruption. The sun drops below the horizon at the end of November and does not return until February. Try to picture that. Several months of continuous, absolute darkness. Not twilight. Not the dim gray of an overcast afternoon, but real, impenetrable night, where at noon it is so dark that you cannot distinguish your own hand without a torch. The psychological weight of that darkness alone is enough to break the human spirit. Now layer onto that the physical reality of survival in such conditions without electricity, without central heating, without modern insulation of any kind. Firewood must be hauled from enormous distances because trees in the tundra do not grow taller than a human being, and most are stunted. Twisted things barely fit for kindling. Hunting is possible only during a few desperately short months of the year. For the rest of the time, animals either migrate hundreds of miles south or burrow into hibernation. Fishing in winter means breaking through a solid meter of ice with hand tools. Day after freezing day, agriculture is impossible in principle. Even the hardiest root vegetables cannot ripen during the brief, cold summer. The question practically asks itself, would you agree to move there? In the 15th century, when there were neither kerosene lamps nor matches, neither canned provisions nor warm synthetic clothing. Of course you would not. No rational human being would, because a person always seeks where conditions are better, never where they are worse. This is the most basic instinct of survival, hardwired into our biology across millions of years of evolution. We move toward warmth, toward fertile soil, toward places where crops can be grown and children can be fed without the constant specter of starvation. The far north is the complete and total opposite of all this. There is nothing there that a human community needs for a normal, sustainable life. There is only cold, darkness, and a relentless daily struggle merely to exist until the next sunrise, whenever that sunrise might come. So why, at the end of the 15th century, does the Russian Tsar send his warriors there? Why do armed military detachments march into places where simply surviving is already a feat worthy of legend? Historians call it the development of new lands. They speak with great authority about the expansion of state borders, the search for new trade routes, the natural ambition of a growing empire. But let us do something historians rarely invite us to do. Let us count the actual cost. To outfit a single expedition to the Arctic requires staggering resources. Ships or massive overland caravans loaded with provisions to last months, weapons and ammunition for hundreds of men, warm clothing stitched from the heaviest furs, tools for building fortifications in frozen ground, and enough surplus to account for the brutal attrition that such a journey guarantees. And all of this, for what exactly? For fur? There was more than enough fur in far more accessible regions to the south. For fish? Rivers in the Central Territories teemed with it. For trade routes? In lands where movement is physically impossible for 6 months of every year, no trade route could ever justify the investment. The economics simply do not add up. The costs are colossal, and the projected profit is dubious at best, non-existent at worst. There is only one explanation that survives rational scrutiny. Something of extraordinary value was already there. Something worth the lives of entire expeditions. Gold? They did not find it in the expected quantities. Precious stones? Neither. So what could possibly have drawn the attention of a distant throne with such magnetic, irresistible force? Here the story takes its strangest turn. The Tsar does not send merchants to negotiate. He does not dispatch tradesmen to barter. He sends troops, armed, battle-ready warriors carrying swords and orders. This is not a trading expedition. This is a military operation, planned and executed with the precision of a campaign against a known enemy. The most common explanation offered by mainstream historians is that these soldiers were protecting future settlements from hostile northern tribes. A reasonable theory on the surface, until you press it with a single uncomfortable question. If the North was truly empty, if it was nothing more than a frozen void populated by a handful of scattered nomads in reindeer-skin tents, then what exactly were these massive armed forces protecting the settlers from? Mosquitoes? Blizzards? You do not send an army to guard against weather. You send an army when there is an opposing force, an existing population, a civilization that must be confronted, subdued, or destroyed. And indeed, what the soldiers found when they arrived was not emptiness. It was not silence. What waited for them in that frozen darkness was something that would challenge everything the new rulers wanted the world to believe. Official history tells us that when those armed detachments penetrated the frozen north, they encountered the Nenets and Samoyeds, nomadic peoples living in portable yurts of reindeer hide who followed their herds across the endless tundra. Simples aborigines, we are told. Primitive souls needing civilization and instruction. The narrative is clean and convenient, painting a picture of emptiness waiting to be filled, of wilderness waiting to be tamed. But there is one deeply inconvenient fact that historians consistently prefer to ignore. The Nenets themselves, those supposed pinnacles of northern primitivism, told legends about an entirely different people who lived on these lands long before any nomad arrived. They called them the Sahertia, and the descriptions of these people are nothing like the image of wild northerners shivering in animal skins around a sputtering fire. Open any serious collection of Nenets mythology and search for what is written about the Sahertia. The details are remarkably specific for what scholars dismiss as folklore. The Sahertia came to Yamal from the sea. They were not wanderers who stumbled upon the peninsula by accident. They were seafarers who understood navigation, who built vessels capable of ocean crossings, who arrived with purpose from somewhere across the water. At first they settled on an island, but when its shores began to erode and collapse, they moved to the mainland peninsula. Their way of life differed profoundly from the Nenets. They did not raise domesticated reindeer but hunted wild ones. They wore beautiful clothing adorned with metal pendants that shimmered as they moved. In some legends, they are described as guardians of silver and gold, master blacksmiths whose forges burned hot beneath the northern sky, after whom iron products remained scattered across the earth and buried in the ground below. These are not characteristics of primitive cave dwellers. These are markers of a metallurgical civilization, a people who understood smelting and metalwork at a level demanding generations of accumulated knowledge. But then the legends take a turn that has allowed scholars to dismiss them entirely. One day, the Sihirtia retreated to the hills and became underground inhabitants. They emerged to the tundra surface only at night or when thick fog concealed their movements. And in their underground realm, legends claim they possessed whole herds of mammoths, underground dwellers tending mammoths beneath frozen earth. This, historians declare with visible relief, is classic mythology, fairy tales for children around a campfire. Case closed. But read further into those same traditions, and you find something far more unsettling for the official version. The Sihirtia, the legends also state, had an advanced culture. Externally, they resembled Russians, with fair hair and light skin, only shorter in stature. They fished, hunted wild animals, and sustained themselves with practiced efficiency. Furthermore, legends insist the Sihirtia possessed extraordinary strength, a vitality that seemed almost supernatural to the nomads who encountered their traces. Something here does not add up. On one hand, mythical creatures dwelling underground with mammoths like characters from fantasy. On the other, strikingly real people with European features engaged in ordinary fishing, hunting, and metalworking. It is as though someone took genuine historical events and wrapped them in a fairy tale covering, adding mythological embellishment to a core of lived memory. The details are too specific for pure invention. Myths do not typically describe skin color, hair type, and relative height of imaginary beings with the precision of an ethnographic report. Myths speak of gods and monsters, not short, fair-haired blacksmiths who preferred hunting wild reindeer over domesticating them. The Sihirtia legends read less like fantasy and more like the fading memory of a real people, distorted by centuries of oral transmission, but never entirely losing their factual skeleton. Now, consider a critical detail that transforms legend into something far more tangible. The Nenets call these people Sihirtia in their own language, but there exists another name, Pakora, derived from the river at whose mouth they reportedly lived. And here the story crosses from mythology into documented history. Pakora is not merely a legendary name whispered around campfires. Open any serious encyclopedia of northern Russian ethnography and you will find it stated in plain clinical text. The vanished people, Peshora, not extinct, not assimilated, vanished. Consider the weight of that word chosen by scholars who select terminology with deliberate care. Extinct implies a known cause, a traceable decline. Assimilated suggests gradual blending into surrounding populations. But vanished means gone without a trace, as if erased from the face of the earth. Now connect the threads. The Pekora, this officially acknowledged vanished people, match in virtually every detail the descriptions found in a completely separate and far older tradition. The legends of the white-eyed chud. These stories circulate across an enormous geographic range, from the Russian north through the Urals and deep into Siberia, telling of a mysterious people with light skin and European features who possessed advanced craftsmanship and deep metallurgical knowledge. A people who, when confronted by new rulers bearing crosses and swords, chose a fate that haunts every culture, remembering them. Rather than submit, the Chud went underground. They dug pits, erected wooden supports, climbed inside with their families and possessions, then knocked out the supports, collapsing the earth above them. An entire civilization choosing collective self-burial over subjugation. The same characteristics appear across these supposedly unrelated traditions. Light skin and European features. Developed metallurgy and sophisticated craftsmanship. The same vast northern territories spanning the Urals and Siberia. Always the same haunting conclusion. Disappearance without explanation. Many will insist this is coincidence. That different peoples independently invented similar legends that merely happen to mirror each other. But coincidence has limits. When physical descriptions match, when geographic territories overlap precisely, when cultural capabilities align, and when the final fate described is identical across traditions, separated by hundreds of miles and countless generations of oral transmission, we are no longer looking at coincidence. We are looking at scattered fragments of a single suppressed history. A history that someone worked very hard to ensure would never be reassembled into a coherent picture. And the most disturbing question remains unanswered. If these people truly vanished, if they truly went underground as every tradition unanimously insists, then what exactly lies beneath the frozen surface of Yamal? Waiting in the silent darkness below the permafrost for someone brave or foolish enough to look? At first glance, it seems we are dealing with ancient legend, overgrown with mystical details. Underground kingdoms, vanished peoples, herds of mammoths beneath the frozen earth. This sounds like the kind of story told to entertain children during the long polar night. Nothing more. And that conclusion would be perfectly logical. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly comfortable, until you start examining what archaeologists have actually found on Yamal. Because the physical evidence waiting beneath the tundra does not care about comfortable conclusions. Strange entrances carved into hillsides are still being discovered across the peninsula to this day. Man-made tunnels that descend deep beneath the surface, plunging into the frozen ground at angles that suggest deliberate engineering rather than natural erosion. Moreover, these entrances could not have been excavated with the simple bone and stone tools attributed to the nomadic cultures of the region. The walls are processed with such precision that they appear polished, smooth to the touch, like the interior of a cathedral column. The vaults overhead hold themselves in place without visible supports. A feat requiring serious structural calculations, an understanding of load distribution and material stress that belongs to the world of trained engineers, not wandering reindeer herders. And the strangest detail of all is that many of these tunnels simply stop at a certain depth, halting abruptly as though the workers dropped their tools midway through a shift and never returned. As though something interrupted the work so suddenly that there was no time even to finish a corridor. Historians offer their standard explanation with practiced confidence. These are natural caves, they say, slightly modified by local inhabitants for storing supplies. A common and unremarkable practice among nomadic peoples across the Arctic. Perfectly ordinary. Nothing to investigate further. But if that explanation satisfies you, then answer a simple question. Why are these entrances found precisely in those locations where Nenets legends place the settlements of the Sahertia? Why does the geography of the tunnels match the geography of the myths with such uncomfortable accuracy? And why, on the walls of certain tunnels, are there clearly visible traces of metal tools? Tools that nomadic peoples living in yurts and following reindeer herds should never have possessed? The entire framework collapses under the weight of this single observation. Nomads do not build underground structures. They have no need for them. And the very concept contradicts the fundamental essence of a nomadic existence. Why would anyone invest months of backbreaking labor digging tunnels in ground as hard as concrete when you plan to abandon that location within weeks? Underground constructions are created exclusively by settled populations, by people who intend to inhabit a single place for decades or centuries, people who think in terms of permanence rather than seasonal migration. The conclusion becomes inescapable once you allow yourself to follow the evidence rather than the textbook. The legends about a people who went underground describe not some mystical transformation into fairy tale creatures. They describe a real historical event, either a forced relocation into subterranean shelters during a time of violent upheaval, or the desperate act of survivors hiding inside already existing underground structures. Structures built by a sophisticated civilization that existed long before the catastrophe struck. The tunnels of Yamal are not storage cellars modified by nomads. They are the silent, frozen proof that someone with advanced engineering knowledge once called this land home. And this leads us to the most fundamental question of all. Why did people settle in these places to begin with? What compelled them to build cities and dig tunnels in a region where a modern person equipped with a tent, thermal sleeping bag, and a month of canned provisions would struggle to survive a single week? The simplest and most logical explanation is one that mainstream science refuses to entertain seriously. The climate was completely different. Open the writings of ancient authors who described a land they called Hyperborea. The Greek historian Herodotus mentioned peoples dwelling in the far north beyond the reach of the cold north wind. The Roman scholar Pliny the Elder wrote of a blessed northern territory where the sun shines continuously for 6 months, where the inhabitants live in groves and sacred forests, where disease is unknown and death comes only when the aged, satisfied with life, choose to depart willingly. Diodorus of Sicily described Hyperboreans as dwelling on a fertile island in the far north, where the climate was so gentle that the land produced 2 harvests every year. These ancient geographers and historians, writing independently across different centuries, consistently placed this paradise beyond the Riphean Mountains. Which classical scholarship identifies with the Urals? Beyond the Urals lies exactly the territory where the lifeless Arctic now sprawls in every direction. Historians dismiss Hyperborea as a beautiful fairy tale, a myth of northern paradise invented by ancient writers who romanticized lands they had never visited. A charming literary device. Nothing more. But if Hyperborea is pure fiction, then explain what paleontologists keep pulling from the permafrost. Geologists working across Siberia and the Arctic regularly discover extraordinarily well-preserved remains of woolly mammoths, animals frozen so perfectly that their flesh, hair, and internal organs survive intact after millennia in the ice. And, in the stomachs of certain specimens, scientists have found something that should be impossible: undigested green grass. Fresh, fibrous plant matter that looks as though the animal had been grazing mere hours before it died. Grass that simply cannot grow anywhere in the Arctic at modern temperatures. Sit with that detail for a moment. A mammoth was standing in a field, peacefully chewing green, juicy, abundant grass. Enough grass grew there to sustain herds of animals weighing several tons each. And if vegetation capable of feeding massive herbivores flourished across these territories, then the climate must have been radically unrecognizably different from what exists today. Warm, mild, hospitable, perfectly suitable not only for animal life, but for large-scale human civilization. What happened? What transformed territories of meadows and enormous grazing herds into an icy wasteland where nothing survives? Official science explains this through the gradual climate shifts of the Ice Age, a process stretching across tens of thousands of years, during which animals and humans slowly adapted or migrated to more favorable regions. A slow, gentle, almost peaceful transition. But the mammoths, frozen with fresh food in their bellies, tell a violently different story. These animals did not have time to digest their final meal. They did not wander south seeking warmth. They froze where they stood. Mid-chew, within hours or perhaps minutes. This is not gradual cooling measured across millennia. This is a catastrophe of planetary scale. Instantaneous and merciless. Ocean levels shifted dramatically. Arctic waters froze into a solid shell. Temperatures plummeted by dozens of degrees within days. And it did not happen in some impossibly distant past, safely buried in geological time. The evidence suggests it occurred far more recently than any textbook dares to admit. That single cataclysm buried everything. The cities, the ports, the irrigation systems. The entire infrastructure of a thriving northern civilization vanished beneath ice, snow, and meters of frozen sediment. The lands where abundance once reigned became a lifeless tundra overnight. And it is precisely into those dead lands that the so-called settlers later arrived, carrying not curiosity but swords, not questions but orders. But the settlers did not arrive blindly. They did not stumble into the frozen north by accident, groping through blizzards hoping to find something worth the journey. They had maps, detailed maps of cities that once thrived in these territories before the catastrophe buried them. And this is where the documentary record becomes extraordinarily suspicious. Because until the 18th century, descriptions of Siberia and the far north, written in Russian, are almost entirely non-existent. Open any comprehensive list of cartographers from the era of the so-called Great Geographical Discoveries. You will find hundreds of names representing dozens of nations. Ancient Greeks and Romans left meticulous maps of the known world. Arab travelers charted trade routes across the most forbidding deserts. Chinese emperors commissioned elaborate atlases of their vast possessions. Persian scholars composed geographical treatises of remarkable sophistication. Soon after came the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English, each nation contributing its own detailed surveys of coastlines, river systems, and continental interiors. And where are the Russian cartographers? Where are the descriptions of the enormous territories that supposedly belonged to Russia for centuries? They are simply not there. A void where an empire's geographic memory should be. We are told about a legendary artifact called the Great Map from the time of Ivan the Terrible. Supposedly, the most detailed cartographic rendering of all Russian lands, stretching from the western borders to the farthest eastern outskirts. A map allegedly used constantly for planning military campaigns and trade expeditions, consulted by generals and administrators, studied by diplomats and merchants. A document of supreme strategic importance to the largest contiguous state on Earth. And yet this map, we are informed with a straight face, existed in a single copy and was simply worn out from frequent use. It did not survive to the present day. Consider the staggering absurdity of this claim. The works of Plutarch, written nearly 2,000 years ago, have survived across centuries of war, fire, and civilizational collapse. Ptolemy's maps from the 2nd century have reached us in multiple copies. Roman road atlases from the 5th century are studied by modern historians in well-preserved manuscripts. Yet a drawing from the 16th century, a crucial state document of a vast empire at the peak of its power, simply vanished because too many people looked at it. Any important state document of that era existed in multiple copies as elementary administrative practice. Duplicates for the Tsar, for the treasury, for regional governors, for the central archives. But the most important map the empire ever produced existed in a single fragile version that nobody thought to reproduce. The maps were not worn away by handling. They were deliberately destroyed. It was a calculated act of documentary purging. Because the truth recorded on those maps contradicted the new version of history being constructed. Those maps showed Tartaria, a state encompassing hundreds of cities spread across modern Siberia, the north and the Far East. Cities whose existence could not be permitted in an official narrative where these lands were declared wild, uninhabited, and patiently awaiting the arrival of civilization. But let us move beyond the maps to something even more revealing. Look at the portrait of Yermak Timofeyevich, the legendary Cossack who supposedly conquered Siberia for the Russian crown. Study his armor carefully, the shape of his helmet, the style of his weaponry. What you see is not a Russian warrior. What you see is a Spanish conquistador. The resemblance is not approximate. It is exact. The same breastplate design, the same helmet profile, the same martial bearing captured in paint, as though the artist were working from the same military catalog used to outfit Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. And this is not artistic license or a painter's whim. This is a clue hiding in plain sight. The conquest of Siberia and the far north proceeds in precise synchronization with the colonization of America, Africa, and Asia. Consider the dates and let the pattern emerge. 1519. Cortés begins the destruction of the Aztec Empire in Mexico. 1532. Pizarro invades the Inca Empire in Peru. 1581. Yermak sets out to conquer the Siberian Khanate. 1596. Willem Barents explores Novaya Zemlya and Spitsbergen. Everything unfolds within the same compressed time frame. A difference of several decades across a global operation is practically simultaneous execution. It is as though a single command was issued, and conquest campaigns ignited across every continent at once. Notice the careful substitution of language that makes the same brutal process sound different depending on where it occurs. In America, it is called conquest. In Africa, colonization. In Asia, expansion. And in Siberia, development. 4 different elegant words concealing one identical reality: the violent seizure of territories that already belonged to someone else. The operational blueprint is identical everywhere. Armed detachments arrive, flying the flag of a sovereign state. Following close behind come missionaries carrying crosses and holy books. The Christianization of the local population begins immediately. Those who accept the new faith are taxed and absorbed. Those who resist are physically eliminated. The survivors are stripped of their language, their customs, their cultural identity, and their historical memory. They are assimilated into the conqueror's system until nothing remains of what they once were. And observe the astonishing speed. Cortés conquers the vast Aztec Empire in 2 years. Pizarro subdues the sprawling Inca civilization in 3. Yermak captures the Siberian Khanate in barely more than 1. This is not gradual expansion measured across generations. This is a 16th century blitzkrieg executed with ruthless efficiency on a planetary scale. The Cossack detachments that pushed into the north and Siberia moved primarily by river, navigating the vast waterway networks in armed boats. They were called pathfinders, though a more honest title would be river pirates. They were ushkyniks, armed raiders who attacked trade caravans, stormed settlements, and seized hostages for ransom. Officially, historians explain their mission in noble terms. They defended Russian lands from nomadic raids. They expanded state borders, bringing civilization to backward peoples. They established trading posts for economic development. If that is true, then explain one simple contradiction. Why did they not patrol the borders of the empire, protecting its frontiers from external threats? Why did they instead plunge deep into the interior of territories where no foreign enemy existed? Why did they construct fortresses not along the periphery, but in the heart of Siberia and the far north? And why was tribute the first thing demanded from every local population they encountered, rather than trade agreements or diplomatic relations? Because this was not border defense. This was conquest of the most calculating kind. The goal was to seize control of already existing trade routes, to occupy already functioning settlements, and to commandeer already operational infrastructure. And when Barents arrived on the shores of Spitsbergen and Novaya Zemlya, supposedly opening these lands for European science, he did not find deserted coastlines. He found settled territory, warehouses for storing furs, docks built to receive ships, navigation markers guiding vessels through treacherous channels, cemeteries where dozens of people lay buried according to Russian Orthodox ritual, on islands in the Arctic Ocean where theoretically no European had ever set foot, not traces of temporary hunting camps, traces of permanent, organized, long-term habitation designed for year-round life in the harshest environment on Earth. The North was not developed from scratch. The North was cleared. What already existed there was systematically dismantled. And then history was rewritten to declare these lands wild, desolate, and ignorant of civilization. No single example illustrates this process more vividly than the fate of Mangazeya, a legendary trading city located deep within the Arctic. Merchant ships from across the known world converged on its docks. The English, the Dutch, the Russians, the Scandinavians, all of them drawn by trade so intense and so profitable that the central authorities in Moscow could not fully control the flow of wealth passing through its warehouses. Mangazeya was not a frontier outpost clinging to survival. It was a thriving commercial hub, a crossroads of international exchange operating in a region that official history insists was empty wilderness. And what did the government do when confronted with a center of commerce it could not dominate? It simply forbade anyone from going there. A decree was issued, closing one of the largest trading centers in the entire North. The official explanation borders on comedy. Authorities claimed they could not organize customs control. Consider the absurdity. Customs collection had been successfully established in Arkhangelsk. Duty systems functioned smoothly across dozens of ports, but in Mangazeya, where goods poured in from vast territories and fortunes changed hands daily, it was somehow impossible to station a handful of officials to collect taxes. They did not prohibit Mangazeya because customs posed a logistical challenge. They prohibited it because what flourished there belonged to an older system that threatened the new order. The wrong people were trading. The wrong goods were moving. The very structure of commerce operated along networks that predated the current rulers and owed them nothing. Mangazeya was a living fragment of an ancient trade web, a system that once connected enormous territories through unified routes, a system that had to be destroyed and replaced with channels the new masters could monitor and exploit. And when the local population resisted the dismantling of their world, they were met with a brutality that strips away every pretense of civilizing mission. In 1742, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna issued a decree regarding the Chukchi that contained language so extreme it reads like a command from a different species entirely. The wording did not say, conquer. It did not say subjugate or pacify or bring to order. It said annihilate completely. Exterminate to the last person. This was not a military directive against an armed adversary threatening the borders of the empire. This was an order for genocide against a people whose only crime was refusing to surrender everything they were. Meanwhile, the Dutch scholar Nicolaas Witsen painted an entirely different portrait in his writings about the Samoyeds, the Nenets people. He described how they voluntarily surrendered to the authority of their imperial majesties. Prompted by the friendly reception of the Russians, they marveled at the might of Moscow, the luxury of clothing, the splendor of buildings. They voluntarily accepted governors who created laws for these simple people. Wooden fortresses were built with which this timid and weak population was governed with gentleness and without effort. A beautiful watercolor of peaceful enlightenment, composed by a foreign observer who understood exactly which version of events his hosts wished to see recorded for posterity. The reality was saturated in blood, Major uprisings erupted across the north and Siberia and were suppressed with devastating force. Chukchi, Nenets, Yakuts, and dozens of smaller peoples fought back with everything they possessed, and resistance continued for decades. Entire tribes were annihilated to the root. Those who refused submission were destroyed, along with their wives and children. Their settlements burned, their cultural artifacts scattered or buried. The pattern is identical to what the Spanish conquistadors inflicted upon the indigenous peoples of South America, identical to what French colonizers perpetrated across Africa, identical to what the English administered throughout India. The same rehearsed scheme deployed simultaneously across every continent, differing only in the language used to describe it afterward. And marching alongside the soldiers came something even more lethal than swords and muskets: diseases, smallpox, plague, mysterious fevers, epidemics that consumed entire populations faster than any army could. Historians characterize this as tragic coincidence, an unfortunate accident in which Europeans unknowingly carried pathogens against which indigenous peoples had no immunity. Nobody intended harm. It simply happened. But documents from the colonial period tell a far darker story. In America, there exists evidence that British soldiers deliberately distributed blankets contaminated with smallpox to Native American communities. A documented instance of biological warfare employed in the 18th century with full knowledge of its consequences. The same devastating combination operated throughout the North and Siberia. Christianization plus epidemic plus the strategic bribery of local leaders. The classic triad of colonization, perfected and deployed on every continent simultaneously. Recently, a ship frozen in permafrost was discovered on Yamal. A local researcher named Pavel Sidye excavated the vessel and documented its contents. Massive hand-forged nails, each one unique, bearing the unmistakable marks of individual craftsmanship. Fragments of an anchor showing characteristic patterns of manual metal processing. Structural elements of the hull indicating shipbuilding technologies far older than anything modern. Historians examined the find and dated it to the 1970s. A typical Soviet-era vessel, they declared, that somehow became trapped in permafrost barely 50 years ago. Look at those nails and judge for yourself. Each one was shaped individually by hand at a forge. No two are identical. This technology vanished from industrial practice by the early 20th century. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union was launching spacecraft into orbit, constructing nuclear power plants, and programming early computers. Yet in the Arctic, someone was allegedly hand-forging unique iron nails, one at a time, for a wooden ship. The dating has been adjusted to fit a convenient narrative. The vessel is far older than any official is willing to acknowledge. But admitting its true age means accepting that permafrost preserves objects from an era that has been carefully and systematically erased from the historical record. Every transformation of the Northern Territories traces back to a single watershed moment: the rise of the Romanov dynasty. Before them, one worldview governed these lands. After them, something entirely different was imposed. The Christianization of Russia is officially dated to the 10th century, with Prince Vladimir and the mass baptism along the Dnieper. But the actual Christianization of the vast northern and Siberian territories occurs in the 17th and 18th centuries, simultaneously with the construction of new capitals, the founding of port cities, and the complete restructuring of governance across the empire. This is not gradual evolution. This is revolution. A violent change of power, population, and historical paradigm executed within a few generations. The North remembers what the archives have been purged to forget. Permafrost preserves what human hands attempted to destroy. Ships built with archaic technologies, underground structures no nomad could have engineered, remains of people with European features buried in regions where only Mongoloid populations were supposed to exist. And as the climate warms and the ancient ice retreats, each thaw season reveals new artifacts, new contradictions, new questions that the official version cannot answer without unraveling entirely. Stone does not lie. Ice does not fabricate. Permafrost does not compose fairy tales. Somewhere beneath that frozen silence, sealed in a tomb of ice created by a catastrophe that erased an entire civilization from living memory, the truth waits with infinite patience for the moment when it will finally surface into the light of a world that is only now learning how to look.